income below either 150% of the federal poverty level or 60% of the state median income level, whichever is higher. And the so 150% is the most, and the Fed say 110% is the lowest. Virginia's in the middle, as was mentioned by Mr. Randall. 130% of federal poverty level is Virginia's income cutoff level to be eligible for LIHEAP assistance. But there are other variables. To be eligible for the cooling assistance, for example, you have to have a vulnerable member of your household elderly, disabled, a child under 5. While that's not required for the heating program, it is a factor in heating assistance amount and when the allocation is made. So some of the other criteria, being responsible for a heating or cooling bill, etc., are spelled out there on page 5. At the bottom of page 5, as I mentioned, there have been some concerns about the declining appropriation, what effect it's had on the percentage of the home heating costs that's met by the program. And they point out that it's a function of two things. One is the declining appropriation, but the other thing is increases in costs. Of course, with this year, with the declines in oil prices, declines in natural gas prices, I don't know how it's going to play out in the future. Finally, on page 6, if you're interested, there's a breakdown percentage of the approved households by energy source. 60% relying on electricity, 18% on fuel oil that's delivered to your house, 11% on natural gas, and smaller numbers on coal, wood, or propane. And the average benefit by energy source, with the heating oil being the largest average benefit of $392. For electricity is $345. Then there's some charts comparing states, but also 2 pages with some information from the DSS annual report, which shows trends in fuel assistance, cooling assistance, and crisis assistance for Virginia, with the number of households served for each year, as well as the average payment per household. And if there are any questions?
Just one, Franklin, is on your last page. I noticed that the drop, and I assume this is non-inflated dollars, this is real appropriations in the federal government, has dropped $1.3 billion from $8 billion down to $6.7 billion in the intervening from fiscal year 10 to fiscal year 13. One would assume, I guess, that's a direct result of appropriations in the budget and
Yes.
Sequestration language.
I don't know if it's sequestration or what. I mean, I think there's been, from looking back at previous years, there have been issues where there have been delays in getting the budget numbers done.
Right.
But what accounts for?
I was just curious, perhaps from over in DSS, you can get the number, because that federal fiscal year 2014 is over.
Yes.
I just wondered what the total appropriation was nationwide on the LIHEAP. Is this a trend line that the federal government is reducing this appropriation as a result of sequestration or whatever's going on in Washington? And we're going to see a continuous trend of cutting of this appropriation for LIHEAP. I don't know if we get that number.
I don't know if DSS is going to, DSS applies for a grant every year.
Right.
When the DSS knows what the federal government's going to do next year with the new Congress, starting with the change in control of the Senate, for example, I can ask what they think is going to happen, but I don't know if they're able to give you any.
Yeah, I'm just curious, because I know the biennial report's due out next year, but if we could get an interim, just broad-based number of what the appropriate, it's important, because what's the trend line? This is, this reduction, and that's a fairly significant percentage reduction across all the states that's gone on in the last 4 years. Is that something that's bottomed out, or is that something that they anticipate going back up, or something that
they have any insight?
I don't know if they have it or not. Thanks, Bill. Environmental groups, conservation groups, utilities, elderly now, low income, talked about all of those things. And now I think would be the appropriate time to discuss any legislation any of the members may be proposing. Yes, Senator Walker.
Mr. Chairman, I would just mention I had requested drafting a piece of legislation very similar to one that passed Pennsylvania last year. And what it would do is with regard to 111D, the agency would have to come back to the legislature for approval of the implementation plan.
All righty. Anybody else? I will tell you also that I have drafted legislation that kind of looks along the line of some of the things we heard from the State Corporation Commission with regards to and basically slowing some things down. We're in a state of flux right now. We don't know what the final rules are going to look like. We don't know what the results of lawsuits that are already been filed, as well as lawsuits that I think everybody who testified up here has said that are coming once the final rules have taken effect, that we don't do anything. I think it's important that we continue to plan once the final rules are there, but I think it's also important that we don't do anything active to reduce or change our current generating mix that we have until we're sure what the results of those lawsuits are. And so I have a piece of legislation that'll be work in progress that I suspect will be the subject of wherever you assign it to, Mr. Chairman, on a full committee. But in an effort to do that, and I think that Delegate Miller has proposed a interesting setup with regards to the Attorney General that I think deserves a little bit more exploring. Yeah, sure, go ahead. We have copies of some bills here that will be submitted here, and again, they're works in progress that we just had to get some placeholders put into place so we could start to work on this legislation. And yeah, I'll be available to take comments from the members, offline, online, however we want to do this while we work our way through this process. But clearly, I think that the position that Virginia finds itself in with respect to the fact that we're having to meet a threshold that far exceeds those of our neighboring states, and will result in significant impact to both ratepayers across the board, regardless of whether you're individuals, homeowners, or industrial based.
Explained that they felt it would be late summer before we saw a final rule. I would predict it will probably be later. This is going to be an ongoing question for the legislature. And I think, the biggest concern that I have is that the people, the citizens of Virginia, have an expectation of this legislature and this state government to take some responsibility with regard to the implementation and the regulation of things like utility bills. And I think Virginia's done a pretty good job of it. But when the federal government takes it upon itself to overreach in an arbitrary fashion, such as we've seen with these proposed regs, it becomes incumbent upon us, and I think incumbent upon the Office of the Attorney General and the Governor, to speak on behalf of the people. And I'm not getting a real satisfied feeling out of how we have spoken.
I share your concerns, Mr. Chairman. We heard from testimony from the State Corporation Commission in no uncertain terms that they felt that this regulation was arbitrary, capricious, and unlawful. That's pretty strong language from the State Corporation Commission, and in fact, that's very, very strong language from that. And I'm not at all pleased at all with the response we've heard from the Attorney General's office when you hear such strong language coming out of the State Corporation Commission. I think clearly they wouldn't have made that if they didn't feel, A, that was the case, and B, that the impact to the ratepayers in Virginia would be significant, very significant. And so I think it's up to the legislature to certainly increase the concern level and result of everybody here, that we raise this up as a major issue. Hence, part of the rationale for my bill is going to be to slow everything down. It's not act rashly, and let's not do anything till we know where we're at, and provide some degree of certainty. Anybody else? Well, listen, thank you all very, very much. We're ready to start the regular session and get into the meat of this as we go through.
Speakers from the public?
We had not planned on having it, and we had it at one of the earlier meetings. There will be ample time, I think, when the
A lot of
bills.
people out here.
All right, I'll take 3 speakers, and we're losing our quorum. We've already lost our quorum, but go ahead. If you have 3 designated